Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Olushola, and I am representing the team of the Association of Classical Christian Educators Africa. I want to welcome you all to the June edition of our webinars. We usually have webinars and book clubs monthly, and this month we happen to have another webinar, and I will just briefly talk about the Association of Classical Christian educators before we bring in our brother to speak. Um, so at the ACCE Africa, we are dedicated to providing a range of valuable resources to parents, to students, and to educators, and to all those who have deep interest in the liberal arts tradition in Africa. So we have a wide selection of materials, including curriculums. We write articles, we have seminars, and so many other activities that we do just to get parents engaged and to broaden their understanding of what classical Christian education is all about. Our mission is our mission is to dedicate to reform education in Africa through truth, goodness, and beauty. And we are looking at equipping families and educators to cultivate wisdom and virtue in the next generation. We have our mission, our vision here too, and our hope is that we would be able to actualize all of these within a very short time. Today we have a special guest, a very, very special guest. We have Brother Lennox Kalifungwa. Brother Lennox is a cultural strategist and visionary dedicated to cultivating a distinctly Christian way of life across all spheres in the homes, in our churches, in the marketplace, and across the nations. Through his writing and public speaking, he challenges all of us to think theologically and to live faithfully, with particular emphasis on education, politics, economics, and the shaping of culture. Brother Lennox is based in Moscow, Idaho. He serves in affiliation with the new St. Andrew's College, and he hosts two thought-provoking shows. You can find them on YouTube. One is called Of Flames and Crowns, and the second one is called Kings and Statesmen. You would really love to listen to what he has to say with his team over there. He's married to Simbi, and they are raising three children together in the joy and discipline of the Christian faith. Today he would be speaking on educating righteous troublemakers. When Brad Lennox sent me this topic, I was just smiling, and I know that we all are eager to hear what he has to say today. And without talking too much, I want to invite Brad Lennox to speak.
Well, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that introduction, and I feel so honored to join you all here. It's interesting just having to navigate through time zones. I suppose this is late afternoon slash evening for many of you. In many ways, my day is just still beginning in many ways. But I'm so glad to be here with you all today. Um, yeah, Brother Daniel mentioned just a moment ago that our theme is educating righteous troublemakers. And I'm sure to some degree that this is peculiar. A few of my friends who knew that this was going to be my subject also just laughed when they heard that this was the subject. And I'll explain why I picked this topic in a second. But I wanted to begin with just an account of what the last year of my life has been. And so, close to a year ago, my family and I actually moved to the United States to live in Moscow, Idaho. And I currently work there with New St. Andrew's College. And during this time, I have witnessed both a curiosity and a concern, especially from those outside of Moscow who've wondered what it's like to have a close affiliation with Doug Wilson. I don't know if you're all aware or familiar with Doug Wilson's work, but he has been very influential in classical Christian education. In fact, I don't think it's a stretch to say that he is perhaps one of, if not the greatest pioneer of classical Christian education over the last 4 or 5 decades. Excuse me. So um, he is important to consider as we think about all of this today. And we'll get into that a little bit. Now, on one hand, people wonder what living in a community where controversy has been a consistent theme is like. If you don't know much about Moscow, if you don't know much about the Christian community in Moscow, controversy certainly is something that is prevalent where we are. And on the other hand, you have people who fear what an association with Doug Wilson might do to my reputation. So I had several people who were concerned, why are you spending time with this Doug Wilson fellow who likes to stir up controversy? Do you not know that he holds to some interesting and heretical things and that he's very contentious and dangerous? Of course, all those assertions are things I disagree with. And it's interesting because in the modern evangelical world, slander is considered a sin unless it's aimed at Doug Wilson. That's something I see as a very consistent pattern. I'm yet to see someone who has been slandered as much as he has. And most people have never read anything he's had to say, most of his critics, that is, or even heard him speak, but they've been told by others that he is someone to be marked and avoided. And because of this, several people have expressed concern about my friendship with Doug Wilson. Now, the reason I mention this specifically as we get into our topic today is because I think my move to Moscow could be themed as the pursuit of trouble. And while many may view this as a problem, I embrace it and the opportunity it provides to push back against the darkness and chaos that is prevalent in this world. In fact, I believe that faithful and biblical Christianity is, in fact, the pursuit of trouble. And I believe that the world, the modern world, the world that we live in today, is starved of troublemakers. And I think this is the case for several reasons, but one of them is because totalitarian social ethics have taught many people to be compliant. It has taught many people to never deviate from the status quo and to do what is easy and to survive quietly. And for as long as this pattern exists, I don't think transformation can ever take place. There are many who claim to be reformed in their theology, but who deny the potency of their doctrine when they fail to act and attempt to prompt reform around them. A reformation becomes treated as an intellectual exercise and not an actual transformation of the world. In fact, the way I like to see it is, if you really want to know if someone is reformed, you ought to ask what they're reforming around them. If they're reformed simply because of specific doctrines that they subscribe to, well, that is commendable. And yet they're not really reformed until they begin to reform things themselves, until their homes and their societies, their churches become reformed because of their influence. That's what reformers do. They transform the world around them. And then there are those who desire reformation, but wish to enjoy its benefits without trouble, which is an ironic inconsistency. In other words, you get people who want to see this reform in the broader context of society, but they want to have that reformation without experiencing any kind of difficulty or any kind of trouble. And that's what I'm referring to here as an ironic inconsistency. I believe that reformation fundamentally demands trouble. A reformation will only be realized by troublemakers. And I make mention of this because as we delve into our theme today, I'll be drawing lessons from the Christian community in Moscow as a modern template for what it means to be a righteous troublemaker. For 4 decades, Moscow has been, in many ways, the central locale for the resurgence of classical Christian education. Over several decades, Doug Wilson has been a pioneering voice in these quarters through his founding of Logos School, which is one of the first classical Christian schools in America. I think it was started in probably the 80s, I think, the late 80s, the early 80s, actually. And then he also started the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which is, I think, the biggest classical Christian school association anywhere in the world. I just had the privilege of attending their conference last week in Dallas. And I think there's over 500 schools that are affiliated with the Association of Classical Christian Schools. And it was amazing to actually engage with literally thousands of teachers and headmasters and people who have such a keen interest in classical Christian schools. And Doug Wilson is actually the one who started this association. And then there's New St. Andrews College. Now, that's the college where I work. It's a Christian liberal arts college. And Doug Wilson was also its founder. And this is why I said earlier that Doug Wilson has really been influential in the modern resurgence of classical Christian education. Now, his resume of institutional accomplishments is actually phenomenal. It really is. And the scope of his influence will likely go down in history as a seminal moment in the establishment of Christendom. And yet, I think that Doug's greatest success is the fact that he raised three children who have proved to be compelling and righteous troublemakers. They're extraordinary. Doug Wilson has three children, Rebecca, Nate, and Rachel, and they're all formidable. They're all authors. His two daughters have spoken quite extensively on things like homemaking and just raising children as a mother, and have been very insightful in what they've offered. Nate is an author, he's a filmmaker, and has pretty impressive credentials. And all of them are walking with the Lord. All of them are determined to proclaim truth as and when they have the opportunity to do so. And that's what makes them these compelling and righteous troublemakers. But even beyond Doug Wilson and his family, there are numerous people, numerous families in Moscow who are determined to live faithfully, which has earned them much of the scorn from both the godless and the broader evangelical world. In fact, something I think people would find very interesting is that in Moscow, and by the way, I should clarify on this. Some people, when they read Moscow in Idaho, they read it as Moscow. But actually, it's one of those things where if you really want to know if someone's really from Moscow, Idaho, it's pronounced Moscow as opposed to Moscow, So one of those very interesting distinctions. But when many people think of Moscow, they often like to think of it as this Christian hotbed where everyone there is a Christian and there's no opposition. In fact, it's one of those things that some of Doug's critics like to point at, to say, well, it's easy for him to say what he says because he's just living around Christians. And that's just not true. There's a very vibrant and determined liberal presence in Moscow that despises Christ Church and everything that Doug Wilson stands for. And when I say despises, it can get pretty intense at times. For example, one of Doug Wilson's grandsons is still in trouble with the Moscow judicial system because he defied some of the COVID mandates in 2020. That case is still going on, and I actually think that it's been filed at the Supreme Court in the United States to be heard by them. And this is the kind of trouble Moscow gets in. There's all kinds of hurdles that the Christians have to jump through, and yet their presence is still pretty significant. One of the things that you'll find amazing about Moscow is that on its most vibrant street, Main Street, New St. Andrews is literally right there in the town center, and many of the businesses on Main Street are actually owned by Christians. So there's a very strong, thick Christian presence. Just a few days ago, there was a celebration of Life Day in Moscow, which is basically a celebration of Roe versus Wade having been overthrown 3 years ago by the Supreme Court. And this was celebrated in the town square on Main Street, which was literally shut down. And for a few hours, people have to hear Christians celebrating and feasting and singing psalms and hymns. And it's just this vibrant community that loves to get together for those kinds of things. But all of that is against the grain of how everyone else in Moscow is living. And so this has earned a lot of scorn from the godless. But as I've mentioned as well, there's also several people in the broader evangelical world who don't always appreciate what Moscow stands for. Now, most of you are here because you're convinced that Christian education is the way to go, and that a classical approach provides the context and rigor to produce excellence in learners. And this is commendable, but it's important to ensure that our goal for pursuing classical Christian education is right. And I would like to assert here that the goal of classical Christian education should be to produce righteous troublemakers who can fight evil and build Christ's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. I'll say it again. The goal of classical Christian education should be to produce righteous troublemakers who can fight evil and build Christ's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Another way that I could phrase this is the goal of classical Christian education is to produce reformers who will propagate truth, beauty, and goodness, and who will face trouble in these pursuits. And if you think about it, this is really all it takes to cause all the right kind of trouble. All you really have to do is be a proponent of truth, beauty, and goodness. And that immediately makes you a troublemaker of the good sort, for sure. And one simply has to love what God loves and hate what he hates, and that will invite all kinds of trouble. But I also want you to think about this. Trouble is not really a consequence of the fall. Right? Some people hear that and say, whoa, wait, what do you mean? But if you think about it, in Eden, trouble was actually a part of Adam's mission before disobedience crowned the hearts of men. The exercise of dominion required dealing with trouble. And rather than dealing with it when it mattered by crushing the serpent's head, Adam actually fell for the temptation of ease. So even before he fell, there was some trouble that he needed to deal with, and he didn't. And he fell for that temptation of ease, and that's exactly what caused the world to spiral into all kinds of chaos, even though there's now great hope that overwhelms and overcomes that chaos. And when we understand this, there's a sense in which we should know that we were made for trouble. And I think to avoid trouble is actually to be right where God's enemies want us. God's enemies don't want us involved in trouble. They want us to pursue that ease and pursue that convenience and not to actually deal with trouble. And so the question I am intent on answering this afternoon is really this. How do we educate righteous troublemakers in Africa as we learn lessons from the Christian community in Moscow? And an even more interesting way of phrasing it is, how do we transplant the Moscow mood to other contexts, particularly in Africa? And I have several ideas that I'd like to outline, and I'm just going to make these as anecdotal as possible, just so we can cover a broad spectrum of ground. And hopefully at the end, we can engage in some back and forth conversation and have wonderful dialogue that will be constructive. So the first thing I'd like to assert as an idea in terms that will promote educating righteous troublemakers is ensuring that worship is rightly ordered, that worship is rightly ordered. The phrase that undergirds Moscow's ethos is all of Christ for all of life, all of Christ for all of life. And this refers to living every aspect of life under the lordship of Christ, which flows from the recognition that he is sovereign and that all life actually comes from him alone. In him, all things are held together. And Christ seeks to redeem, reconcile, and restore all things to himself. And this is the framework for a robust integration of all things. So when we speak about Christ being over all, when we speak about this all of Christ for all of life concept, we're talking about really truth here, the integration of truth, Christ being Lord over absolutely everything and everything integrating into Christ himself. He is the ruler of all these things. And in order for us to really gain a comprehensive understanding of the world around us, we must know Christ, all of Christ for all of life. The ordering of our worship is based and accentuated in covenant fellowship with God's people. And this also orients our time. So as we think about this all of Christ for all of life concept, this is really about ordering our worship. And this happens in the context of covenant fellowship with God's people. And this also orients our time, which is why we gather together on the Lord's Day and worship God and God alone in community with people who share our convictions and have also themselves been saved by grace. And it's in these contexts that we're reminded with these great truths about who God is and what he has done in the person and work of Jesus Christ, and how we are to live in light of this truth. And this is important to underscore because when education is narrowly focused, it can actually miss the richness of this thought. All of Christ for all of life is actually a prompt to think and build broadly. If Christ's victory and blessing extends as far as the curse is found, then we ought to think in categories that extend beyond our narrow and pietistic sensibilities. And by pietistic here, what I'm referring to is this idea of pietism that suggests that God's realm does not extend beyond the parameters of the church, personal salvation, and personal devotion, as if God is not interested in the world or the earth. He's only interested in the seemingly sacred areas and corners of life. That's what pietism is. And I think what that actually that pietism actually undermines the sovereignty of Christ. If Christ is sovereign, then he rules and reigns over absolutely everything. The cosmos is his. He has established a throne that extends absolutely everywhere. And pietism actually denies this. And sometimes it denies this. In fact, it often denies this in the name of purity and holiness and in an attempt to be unlike the world. You have these Christians who separate themselves from the world, thinking that's the holy thing to do, and that this is the only little realm that God cares about. And that's an unfortunate way to think. And I think when people think this way, it actually limits the scope of their education. You then cease to have an education that understands the world as under Christ's rule. You begin to think of the world as under the rule of these enemies. And therefore, there really is no concept of what it looks like to redeem or exercise dominion in this world the way that Christ has called us to exercise dominion in this world. And so that's a problem. And so it's necessary for us to have this broad scope of Christ's kingship and his lordship in order for us to even execute education the way we ought to. If we're going to educate righteous troublemakers, these righteous troublemakers have to be well acquainted with who God is and what he is doing in this world. That's fundamental to this. We need an education that stirs a cosmological vision of life in learners, one that invites them to see the wonders of truth, beauty, and goodness in all things. And to speak in pedagogical terms here, I think that this involves just teaching students rich truths. You want to give students this rich array of theological truth that will give them a strong mind and a strong backbone. They need to have a deep and robust understanding of who God is and the world that he's created. And I think this involves teaching students the Bible. It involves teaching students the confessions, the Great Reformed confessions, and the Great Reformed creeds. And this serves to anchor their faith and conviction. This serves to give them this long lineage of history and how believers over time have worshiped this God and how they've understood the Bible and how they have remained faithful over time, and even lessons from history that show how people have deviated from the truth and what kind of consequences have come from that. We need to be teaching all of this, and this needs to be part of our pedagogical process in a very fundamental way. And I think undergirding all this as well is we need to be prayerful ourselves as educators And we need to be teaching our students to pray. This all of life or all of Christ concept is not merely philosophical, it is fundamentally spiritual. This is one of those things I think can easily be overlooked, where we can begin to build the kind of Christianity that is purely intellectual, and doesn't actually reckon with the fact that we are in a cosmic war, that spiritual warfare is something that we ought to be engaged in. Ephesians 6 profoundly gives us this picture of a Christian at war. And I think that's something that we should embrace as Christians. And I think modern Christians have lost this. Modern Christians think that fidelity lies in a sort of niceness that is non-confrontational, that avoids conflict, that is winsome at every turn. It doesn't really have a category for warfare. But if we really do understand that this is warfare, and warfare of a spiritual kind, of a cosmic kind, then I think that this should bring us to our knees, and we should be a prayerful people. And I think that one of the goals that we should be seeking to see in our students is for them to have excellent prayer lives. And I think the question as educators that we should be asking is, what does it look like to instill this, inculcate our students in this practice? How do we help them be people who pray? They're rooted in God's word, they're rooted in truth, but they're prayerful. They understand what it means to live life on their knees. And perhaps this goes beyond just prayer before class time. Perhaps this is specific meditations on prayer. Perhaps this is incorporating prayer in more than just the actual specific schedule in a particular school day. This could look like many different things, but I think that this needs to be underscored. So to cap off this first point, all of Christ for all of life, that's an important ethos here. And I think it undergirds how we should be thinking as educators. I want to move on here and speak about something very that I think lines up with what I've just said here. And this is the second thing here, which is that repentance is warfare. We ought to remember that repentance is warfare. And what I mean by this is that one of the greatest hurdles we're going to face as those who are in the classical Christian world is our own sin. Our own sin is perhaps the most imminent threat to the success of our mission, in building people who are going to be righteous culture makers, propagating truth, beauty, and goodness in all things. We ought to watch our own lives and our own doctrine very closely. And I think the way that's done is by consistently confronting our own sin and repenting of it as and when it rears its head. If we're going to be righteous troublemakers in culture, we need to be the kind of people who understand what righteousness is, understanding that it's undergirded by faith in the person and work of Jesus Christ, which enables us to live in humble obedience to Jesus Christ. And so this repentance really is a form of warfare. If we don't get this right, we'll get nothing else right. It is impossible to build a distinctly Christian culture without a people who have developed a habit of repentance. And this is something that as educators, we need to embrace and understand. And this is, I think, something we ought to be teaching our students as well. We're equipping them with the tools to combat their own sin. Yeah, so the last thing I was just saying there is how we ought to remember that repentance is an important part of our warfare. It's something that we ought to be doing as educators, and something that we ought to be equipping our students to do as well in fighting sin and in living a life that is distinct and holy. This is something I think that we have in our arsenal as educators. Education is a form of discipleship. And what we're really doing in education is appealing to both the mind and the affections of a student. And we want to orient their thoughts and their affections around the true and living God. That's what we want. And a big way that we do that is by helping them um, understand what repentance is and its importance, because repentance is, in fact, warfare. The third thing that I wanted to say here is the importance of being faithful with what you have, right? Be faithful with what you have. And I want to use a lesson here from Doug Wilson. When Doug Wilson started uh, Logos School, I think this was in the early 80s, he did so because he wanted a good school for his daughter. Uh, and he had no real options around him as far as Christian education goes. And so what he decided to do was just to start a school. And this this was very small. It was not glamorous. He didn't have tons of money. In fact, he had no money. And all he had was a desire to give his daughter a Christian education. And that's actually what birthed Logos School. And so I think he got together some friends and they started a school together. Very few students initially. And I think for the first many years, they just worked out of their homes, really. And that's until they found property for the school as a whole. And that's just him aiming to be faithful with what he had. He had a desire, he had a child, and he knew that he needed to glorify God with both. And so he started a school. And I think this just underscores the principle of what can happen with very little. It doesn't take much in order for us to be faithful. Faithfulness, I think, has much more to do with our orientation than it does with our abundance. Right? It's about wanting to live a life that's wholly pleasing to God. And God has given us things. He's given us opportunities. He's given us relationships that he expects us to steward well. And I think that's what faithfulness is really about. It's about the good stewardship of things that God has given us for his glory and for his honor and for the good of others. And this ties into the story with New St. Andrews College as well, because as Rebecca graduated from high school, there were no college options, and Doug still thought it was a good idea for her to continue learning in some capacity. And so he started, alongside a few people, New St. Andrews College. And this year specifically marks 31 years of New St. Andrews College's existence, which is extraordinary. And it literally started not because Doug Wilson had made a lot of money. In fact, he had no money at all. He didn't even really have money to advertise the college. In fact, I think the story is that he put out a little advertisement in a magazine that he used to write, which announced that they were going to be starting a college. And I think he gave a start date, and whoever wanted to join could join. And that's how they advertised for a very long time. Before word of mouth became a thing, before even the internet became a thing. And that's how the college grew, just slowly but faithfully. And today, I think that it is literally the premier institution of higher education in the United States and maybe even the world. It has some of the highest standards with some of the best faculty. And it's not to say that the college is wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. It still in many ways is in its infancy. It still is in many ways just plowing along and trusting God to sustain things. But those small efforts of faithfulness go a long way. And I think a lesson that we can learn from this is that we ought to be faithful even if it's costly. When Doug had started Logos, and I think he actually started teaching himself Latin. Doug was not classically educated. Doug, I think, went to a public school. I think that was literally his upbringing. And he had a good, solid Christian father, so he was exposed to Christianity. But he had to start teaching himself a lot of things. He knew he was persuaded by a classical school of thought. And so he started educating himself. And this cost him time. This cost him some money to to buy the resources or to enroll in classes in order to learn. But he did it because he understood that something significant could be birthed from this. So we should learn from that we can be faithful even when it's costly. In fact, oftentimes our faithfulness will be costly, and that's something I think we have to embrace. We have to be willing to start small. We have to be willing to do what we can. I think in many ways we can all resonate with this here as we try to promote classical Christian education in Africa. This is going to require us to embrace humble beginnings in a big way. There's not many people who think like us. There's not many people who are going to invest in what we're trying to do, but we have something. We have a real desire, we have a real vision, and we ought to pursue it as relentlessly as possible. We ought to be thinking big, but we shouldn't let that thinking big cripple us from being faithful in what we need to do. And the Lord tends to delight in multiplying the small. He tends to use the fewest words to create the greatest worlds. He tends to delight in using the smallest of armies to defy the odds and defeat larger, greater armies. He likes to get the glory in precisely this way. And so I think that we should be encouraged by our humble beginnings, believing that through these humble beginnings, through these small efforts of faithfulness, that we can make a large impact. I am excited to see what is happening in Africa. I am excited to see this specific association come together and grow, because I think this is precisely how African nations are going to be discipled. I firmly believe that. The Lord will not waste these efforts. They may be small, but I think that these are the kinds of efforts that will echo for eternity. And I am very excited to see that happen. The next thing I want to say here, and this is my fourth point, is the need for camaraderie. We ought to recognize our need for camaraderie. And basically what I'm referring to here is understanding that we're not going to be able to realize this grand vision on our own. We're going to need like-minded people. We're going to need friends. We're going to need to build the right kind of company around this great vision we have to educate students in the ways of truth, beauty, and goodness. This is not something we're going to achieve in a silo. You're going to need friends. You're going to need some kind of support. Otherwise, you will find yourself burning out. You'll find yourself just struggling consistently. And this is not to say that you need hundreds of friends or plenty of friends. You just need a faithful few around you who you can join hands with and build. And I think that this is something that's true even in Moscow. As you see these institutions being established, in many ways, Doug Wilson is the figurehead. He is the pastor, the senior pastor of Christ Church. He's the founder of these institutions that we've talked about already. But he did not build these institutions alone. He had good, like-minded people around him. Now, it's also important to mention here that we ought to be choosing these friends wisely. One of the greatest influences of mission drift in history as it concerns Christian institutions is a failure to handle friends well. In an attempt to appease friends, we can often compromise a mission. And friends will always appeal to your affections in a natural way. And so that's something we have to guard against. It's possible for friends to change their minds on certain convictions. It's possible to just sort of bring in anyone into the fray because they're a friend, even though they don't actually embrace your entire ethos. And I think that's something we need to be mindful of. I had a conversation with Doug recently where I was asking him about building Christian institutions. And this is actually a series that will be released on New St. Andrews College's content website. And I'll make sure that you all get a link to it. on building Christian institutions. And one of the things that he mentioned there, and this is a lesson I think he learned from his father, was in order to have a sustainable, well-functioning Christian institution, you need to be willing to fire people and to fire them quickly. um, because sometimes we can play this game of just trying to appease friends rather than actually trying to fulfill a mission. And I think this is an important point to emphasize in Africa. And maybe we'll come back to this on a later point as well, because we live in a culture that likes to appease. We live in what we consider a communal culture. But in this communal culture, you realize that social ethics are always governed by what people think as the common good. And so there's this aversion to stepping on people's toes. There's an aversion to conflict by and large. And by conflict, I mean conflict of whoever you'd consider of your own ilk. Um, and because of this, I think that we're not always very good at saying no to our friends. um, we're not always very good at setting up boundaries between those who are like-minded and those who are not. And I think this is something we need to be very mindful of as we think about being educators who are educating righteous troublemakers. The fifth point I want to make here, and this is a very important one, is the need to promote masculine leadership. One of the things that has been profound to me as I have engaged with Moscow this last year especially, is to see the prevalence of masculine leadership at every turn. Now, at this point, I'm going to say something that might make people feel quite uncomfortable, but I think it needs to be said. I think in the broader classical Christian world, there is an overwhelming amount of feminine leadership. And I'm not saying this necessarily as a bad thing. I think that as women have embraced classical Christian education and are seeking to invest their lives into it and investing their lives into students, this is them being faithful. And I commend them for it and would encourage them to continue going that way. But I think that we shouldn't deny the fact that where you see a prevalence of feminine leadership, that is going to influence the culture of a specific home or a specific school. There's no running away from that. And I think masculine leadership ought to be the principle that undergirds the culture of an institution in order for it to remain strong, in order for it to remain resilient, and in order for it to remain just in all the ways that it needs to. There's something about masculine leadership that is tailored to deal with trouble in a very specific way. Adam is the one who was called to deal with trouble in the garden. It is Christ as a man who comes to deal with trouble in redeeming the world. And I think that even as we think about education, we ought to appreciate this. One of the things I love about Moscow, as I said, in terms of it having this distinct masculine ethos, is that it is the perfect context in which women thrive. I actually think that femininity thrives best under masculine leadership. And I think this is true in homes and in schools. And I think it's something that we can apply effectively there. And I think the necessity of this is in a school, especially, in fact, in both homes and schools, assuming these are mixed schools where you have both girls and boys attending the schools, you're going to need to differentiate between the boys and the girls in a distinct way. And I think what feminine leadership can tend to do is it then appropriates the ethic or the culture of the classroom around feminine sensibilities. Therefore, when boys act like boys, not even acting sinfully, just acting as boys, they can sometimes be reprimanded because they're not acting like the girls. Girls tend to be more compliant. Girls tend to be more put together in that sense. Boys tend to be less compliant. And this is not even necessarily an issue of disobedience. I think in some cases that it could be disobedience, but I think generally speaking, this is just how God has wired boys. And what can end up happening is we then neuter the boys to act like the girls. And I think the way that you distill that is by actually having good masculine leadership. Logos School in Moscow, Idaho, has a couple of people who I absolutely love. Their superintendent is his name is Matt Whitling, and I'd love for you all to connect with him at some point. A phenomenal gentleman, and he has a military background, and you can see him imposing that masculine energy into the school. And the headmaster of the school, his name is Wally, military background, and you can see him imposing that masculine energy on the school as well. It's pretty amazing. And this is Idaho, which means it's a state that loves its guns. And you see these gentlemen literally being armed, and no, not as a way to scare the children at all. This is not the point, but more so as a means of protecting the kids. But even more so, just the culture that they've been able to, I think, enables everyone to thrive. And I think it's able to thrive because there's a distinct masculine leadership there. And I think that's something that we should be striving for as much as possible. This could apply at home, just to mention briefly, it's just fathers being more their children's education. Something that, to give you a leaf out of my book currently, is I'm trying to involve my son in my work. It's just that there's some days I like to take him to the office with me where we're actually able to work on things together. And that's a good way of imposing that sort of masculine leadership that allows everyone and everything to absolutely thrive. The sixth thing that I want to mention here is the importance of embracing an optimistic eschatology, an optimistic eschatology. And I think this is a very important one that is often overlooked because, for one reason or other, we have been told that eschatology is one of those fringe issues that doesn't matter. And yet I actually think that eschatology is one of those that fundamentally undergirds the way that we view the world. The reason I think that this is so important, especially in context, is because in Africa, we have a tendency to be fatalistic. And what I mean by that is we tend to be resigned to ill fortune. We tend to think of ourselves as victims. We tend to think of ourselves as those who are perpetually oppressed. We're the kinds of people who things happen to. We don't really do things. We're just victims, and because of that, we're helpless. And the world around us is helpless. And therefore, we're just resigned to and then that's what fatalism really is. And I think this flies in the face of what the Bible clearly teaches in terms of what Christ has achieved in his redemption. Christ is the banner of his authority. 28 speaks, gives us the commission where Christ says, all authority in heaven and on earth below. Therefore, go and disciple the nation, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to do all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you even to the end of the age. All right, so this is that Christ gives us to disciple the nations under the banner of his authority. His resurrection has made it possible. In fact, I'd even say inevitable for the nations of the world to be discipled. And I think fatalism flies in the face of that. Now, here's the thing. If there's a sense in which we've sometimes Christianized that fatalism, where we then think that, well, this world is passing away and it's diminishing, and therefore we ought not to build and engage if the world is going to end today. If Christ is coming back in this very moment, if we're going to be raptured out of here in the blink of an eye, build anything. And I think that this actually largely contributes to why Africa is the way it is in terms of its lack of distinct and beautiful infrastructure. One of the things that distinguished the Western world in its embrace of an optimistic eschatology is that it gave them a multi-generational vision of things. And this is this is the importance of that optimistic eschatology. It gives you this multi-generational vision of things. Some of the great infrastructure that we commend the Western civilization for was built over centuries. It took a long time. And in order to build something like that, you need to be able to think long term. You need to be able to think in a hopeful way. You need to be able to think in terms of generations and wanting to invest in multiple generations. A fatalism doesn't think that far. Fatalism thinks very much in survival terms. You're just trying to make bread today, and that's about it. You're never really trying to invest in the future. And I think that's the importance of an optimistic eschatology, where we understand that Christ is doing something over time and that he is winning. In fact, the victory belongs to him in a very comprehensive way. And over time, this is going to unfold. So even though the world may look chaotic today, we don't develop, or we ought not to develop, a theology that's based on newspaper clippings, a theology that's based on all the fear-mongering that news media likes to foist upon us. We ought to be developing our theology of the world and our eschatology on what Christ has revealed in his word, especially in what he has achieved in his resurrection and in his redemption. He is doing something in this world, and I think that should free us to think long-term. The only way to really, I think, build righteous troublemakers in a way that's going to result in significant impact is to inculcate this in them as well. You want to give them this hopeful sense of the world where they're thinking about building long-term. They're thinking about how they're going to influence multiple generations of their posterity for Christ, right? That's what we want to see. So I don't think we can work our way around that one. Righteous troublemakers are those who are hopeful about the future. They really are. And so we need to be inculcating them with a real hope and a real optimism rooted in Christ and his redemptive work. The next thing I want to say here, this is the seventh thing, is we should be refusing to play it safe and pursue survival. Refuse to play it safe and pursue survival. One of the things that I've appreciated about the Christian community in Moscow is this very thing. I've had the privilege of sitting very briefly in a New St. Andrews College board meeting. And of course, now that I'm there, I have all kinds of conversations with their president, who's a very good friend of mine, and several other people, including Doug Wilson. And one of the things that they underscore is survival is not the goal. Survival is not the goal. Playing it safe is not the goal. The goal is to be faithful to the mission. And what a lot of people are going to run into, and a lot of you will experience this if you haven't already, is as you endeavor to build, as you endeavor to propagate truth, beauty, and goodness, as you endeavor to build an institution like this association specifically, you're going to run into trouble. You're going to receive threats from all kinds of people. That threat might come from the civil government, for example. And it's going to be very uncomfortable. And when you come across that kind of trouble, the temptation is going to be to want to play it safe, to want to simply survive in the name of living to fight another day. Every Christian institution that compromised and fell away compromised in the name of living long enough to fight another day. Something that I really appreciate about Doug Wilson and many of the rest of the leadership is they often like to underscore the fact that they would sooner die than be unfaithful to their mission. I think we need to live our lives in a way where we're willing to be faithful to the mission, even if that means the shutting down of our institutions. The goal is not to have our institutions live forever. Death is a part of this world in which resurrection is a common theme, right? So institutions come and go. The goal, I think, should be to have those institutions live faithfully for as long as they're alive. Now, in Africa as well, again, because we have this survival mentality by and large, we don't often think in these categories. We often are conditioned from the time we're young to play it safe and to just survive. The reason your typical African child wants to be a doctor or a lawyer is because that's the most affluent way of surviving. It's the most convenient way to live life without having to suffer at all. It's just ingrained in us to always think in terms of survival, to always be seeking to escape poverty, so to speak. And I think we need to be the kinds of Christians who refuse to play it safe, the kind of Christians who are willing to get into trouble for what's right. Now, here's the thing. I think this goes beyond just instructing our students or our children specifically to be thinking this way. I think they have to see that in us. We have to set that example for them. That's one of the things I really appreciate about New St. Andrews College specifically. Over the years, and I think I'll point here to the COVID years, there was a lot of pressure from the local government in Moscow to adhere to the mandates, the tyrannical mandates of the state. And Ben Merkel, the president, understood that he needed to take a stand and set an example for the students and how they ought to live. And I think that's something that I think we can learn from here. We should refuse to be playing it safe. We should refuse to idolize survival and instead choose to be faithful. And that's how we cause all the right kind of trouble. The world is concerned with survivalism. That's not our concern. We are concerned to establish Christ's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. We're concerned to glorify him and enjoy him forever. We're concerned to live the way that he's called us to live, not bow down to the idols of the culture and neuter ourselves by doing so. And tied to this point, I want to move on here to the eighth point, and this will be a very brief one, is I think we need to be willing to lose reputation before the worldly. I think if we're going to stand against the tide of a culture that is dying, we cannot rely on diplomats. And let me assert this. Reformers are not diplomats, right? We need men and women who, to put it bluntly, couldn't care less about their good name. Especially if it means surrendering an inch on the battlefield. And I think, again, this applies in Africa because, man, we love titles. And from what I see it, and this is true about Africa as a whole, but man, Nigeria loves titles. We love to be called doctor. We love those lofty titles. We're always pursuing that level of affluence. Everything in that sense is about appearance and reputation. And I think that we need to recover the virtue of a lost reputation, as I like to put it. We need to start putting less of a premium on our names and our reputation before the world, that is, and seek to honor God in the way that we ought to. And I think that faithfulness to God will often mean disrepute in the world's eyes. And I think that's something we need to be willing to embrace. And then the ninth thing here is, and this will also be a brief point, is we need to learn the art of mocking and destroying cultural idols. It is possible for us to establish great institutions, Christian institutions, that still do nothing to trouble the idolatry of a culture. I like to make reference to I believe he was a Germanic monk. No, was he? Yes, Boniface, Saint Boniface, who went to the city of Geismar with an axe and started to chop down Thor's oak, which of course disturbed many people who warned him against it and hurled all kinds of curses against him should he actually go ahead and cut down this idol. And the story here, and I hope most of you are familiar with this one, the oak eventually falls. And I think some interpretations of this story go on to suggest that he uses that same wood from the tree to go on and build a church, which is such a beautiful story. And I think that we need to take a leaf from Saint Boniface and be willing to mock and destroy idols. In Second Kings, we see an account of King Josiah, who is referred to literally as the most righteous king Judah ever had. And what made him righteous is the fact that he gave no square inch to idolatry. There were great kings, even godly kings before him, who just weren't as concerned with this robust understanding that God ought to be worshipped everywhere and that there should be no room for idolatry. And I think that should be our attitude toward idols. We should not want to see idols anywhere. And in Josiah's case, he didn't just mock the idols. He didn't even just tear down the idols. He literally destroyed them in the most shameful way to those idols. He would incinerate them and literally cast them into land that was forsaken and considered cursed. Right? That's that righteous mockery of idols. And I think we need to recover the kind of Christianity that really is this direct trouble to cultural idols. The world around us should feel uncomfortable. They should hear our voice. They should hear our stands. They should hear us mocking their idols. And in Africa, we have many kinds of idols. African traditional religion is a very big thing. And I think there's a sense in which we ought to be developing students who are going to defile idols, going to mock them and utterly destroy idols. And that's something that I think we ought to inculcate in our students in a fundamental way. There's all kinds of idolatry around us. There's all kinds of traditional African practices around us that ought to be shamed. And I think that we ought to be helping our students think in these categories and again, see our own example of what this actually looks like. Moscow has built a reputation for doing this very sort of thing. And I think a lot of people don't recognize this as a distinct Christian virtue because, again, we live in a modern Christian world where niceness is the supreme ethic and the supreme pursuit of all things. We think we can win the world through our niceness. And that's just not how it's going to be. I think Reformation demands us to confront idolatry wherever we see it, mock it, and destroy it. A few points here before I end my talk here. And the next thing here is also to teach ownership. This is my 10th point, teach ownership. You want to teach your students to assume responsibility for things. You want them to assume responsibility for themselves. You want them to assume responsibility for the people God has given them. You want them to assume responsibility for their opportunities. You want them to assume responsibility for property. And this is, I think, a very core thing. One of the things that I understand the ACCE here stands against is statist edicts, is tyranny. And one of the ways that we undergird tyranny is by teaching people to assume ownership of things, assuming ownership for yourself, assuming ownership of the people God has given you, and everything else that He's given. This is how we curb tyranny. Tyranny is actually enabled by people who are irresponsible, right? It's irresponsibility of the masses that undergirds tyranny. It's when people cease to assume responsibility for themselves that they hand this power over to other people, or specifically a tyrannical state. And I think we need to be teaching students to assume this responsibility in every single area of their life. Assume it. And I think there's a sense in which by establishing institutions like this, you're actually modeling for them what it means to take responsibility, taking responsibility for the education of your children, taking responsibility for the well-being of your societies, building institutions just like this. I think one of the ways to develop that sense of ownership is by actually starting and pioneering institutions of various kinds. We need many more educational institutions, for example. And I think that's something that will develop the right kind of categories for students as they take ownership of things. And when they take ownership for things, they can't be controlled. They can't be manipulated by the state. And that's something we ought to encourage. I could say so much on that one. I wish that was a talk on its own. But I want to move on here a little bit. And this is my 11th point, which is we need to develop a culture of literacy and learning. I think we need to be the kinds of people who read and write good stories. We need to be the kinds of people who are enthralled with a world of words and seek to employ them well. That's something I think I've seen done well in Moscow, where it's beyond just what's happening in the schools. People like to read and they're encouraged to read. This is not really an example about Moscow per se, although it does apply to Moscow. But a few months ago, my family and I had driven out to a town near Moscow, which has a population of something like maybe 200 people. So it's a very small town. But one of the things that I couldn't unsee was the fact that this was still a largely wealthy town. And by wealthy, I don't mean that people are living in 5 bedroom mansions, but I just mean that the people here were enjoying a degree of prosperity. I'd say most of the people in that area were probably farmers, and they were enjoying life. But it was a very small community, very slow pace of life. But one of the things that just stood out to me in this little town is the fact that even though it was so small, limited infrastructure, they had a library. They had a library. And I think that that actually serves to show you something about what kind of culture this is. I think a culture that is thriving is a culture that actually values literacy and learning. And I think that's something we should seek to establish in Africa. To the degree to which we can establish libraries and good libraries, we should absolutely do so. We need to be in the business of publishing books so as to facilitate people's literacy and learning. And we need to develop this as a culture, not just something that happens in school. In fact, one of the things about the Christian liberal arts, classical Christian education, is this emphasis on developing lifelong learners. And that doesn't happen merely through instruction. It happens by trying to develop a whole culture around it. As educators, you should be reading, and you should be reading and sharing what you're reading with your children, with your students. They should see that as a habit that you have formed for yourself as well. Read widely, read great stories, read great books, enjoy them, and not just as part of some rigorous curriculum, but as something that you enjoy to do, even in your time of leisure. And as we land this plane here, I have 2 more points to make. And the next one, this is my 12th point, is to expect excellence and virtue. I think we ought to expect that. There's a sense in which excellence is the substance of righteous troublemaking. Excellence is that thing that makes your students, your children, distinct from the rest of the world. And I define true excellence here as more than mere functionality. I think excellence is craftsmanship that is imbued with beauty, quality, and virtue. It's distinguished by its ability to evoke humility, awe, delight, and wonder that points to the glory of God. It ultimately points to God. And I think at the root of excellence is love. Not self-promotion, actually, but love. Love for God and love for neighbor. And it's in this precise way that excellence is actually a profoundly moral pursuit. It's guided by a relational center. It has an artistic vision that seeks to reflect the beauty. All right, I'll just continue here. This is a great illustration that sometimes I talk too much. All right. Anyway, yeah, the point I was making here is just about excellence, and how the root of excellence is love. Love that is rooted in God and applied towards neighbor as well. So in this sense, excellence is actually a moral pursuit. It seeks to reflect the beauty of our Creator. And I think this is something we ought to be doing, is expecting this excellence from our students. And they do so, I think, by pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness. They do so by pursuing virtue. It is the virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. It's the virtues of faith, hope, and love. It's seeking to inculcate them with all these disciplines, with all these virtues, so as to be excellent, so as to stand out in this world. God's enemies are in the business of stealing, killing, and destroying. Theirs is not the pursuit of excellence, but of distortion. Theirs is an attempt to redefine what excellence is, and to create all kinds of chaos. And I think one of the ways that we challenge that is by expecting excellence of our students, pursuing excellence ourselves, creating order where there's chaos, and seeking to establish beauty in aesthetical fashion that is undeniably outstanding. And so I think excellence is a very important part of our ability to educate righteous nuisances. And I think this is something that I see in Moscow as well. There's this expectation of excellence. There's an expectation for people to think big. There's an expectation for people to work hard, even at school. I'm constantly amazed at how much students at Logos School learn. I've had opportunities uh, to offer some lectureships at Logos School, and I'm just amazed to see the kind of excellence the students are pursuing there, and it's expected of them, and that's something we should uphold. The final point that I want to make here is the importance of celebration. I think that we should be aiming to produce joyful and festive learners. I think one of the great temptations or pitfalls of classical Christian education is to emphasize the rigor without emphasizing the joy of learning, which I think is unfortunate. I think one of the ways that you actually know that you're being successful in your efforts as an educator is when there's a joy in learning in your students. And I think we should be aiming to produce that. And I think that happens by just celebrating often, celebrate things. Make something like Easter a core part of your calendar where you're just celebrating as a school or as a household. Make Christmas a very similar thing. Now, I think there's, in this modern world, this aversion for Christians to not be festive and celebrate. And I want to assert that actually devils don't celebrate things. Again, like they distort things. And for example, to give you an example, one of the great myths is this idea that Christmas is a pagan holiday. Here's the thing: pagans don't do holidays, right? They holiday, literally that word, holy day. They don't do that. They like to distort things. And sure, I think what they tend to do is they like to hijack Christian calendars and seek to twist them. That certainly does happen. But festivity is actually something that's exclusive to Christ. Devils don't delight in festivity. They like to distort feasts. They like to pursue indulgence that looks festive, but is not actually of the substance of festivity. And I think we need to be building the kind of cultures in our homes, in our schools, that teach students how to laugh and how to play and how to enjoy things and savor things. If we're going to promote aesthetics to them, if we're going to promote beauty to them, we ought to be promoting that in a holistic way. It's not just in the visual arts, it's also in the gustatory arts where we're able to taste and see the goodness of God and the things that we enjoy. And so I think celebration is something that's very important. And that's something I've appreciated about Moscow as well. We love to feast. We love to throw parties. We love to be hospitable. There's a robust and vibrant culture of hospitality. And I think that serves to show our students that culture building is not merely done in a classroom. In fact, one of the ways that we build culture is by being hospitable. This festivity is actually a form of warfare. If you want to create righteous nuisances, you need to be building the kind of students who know how to laugh, even in the face of danger. You need to be building the kind of students who know how to feast and delight in things. And I think this is exactly what God gives us, as He gives us these tools for teaching and learning. So as I conclude here, there's just a few remarks I want to make here, and that's just to kind of go back to the idea that I think classical Christian education is all about building reformers. It's about building righteous troublemakers. I believe that Reformation is for lions. It's for those who are willing to act and to fight and to build. And true Reformation demands the willingness to part ways with cultural idols, to destroy those idols, no matter how familiar they may seem. Cultural Reformation has to be built on holiness. It's a distinction that goes beyond just outward forms. We have to be fighting sin in our own lives. A holy people, right? As if God calls us to be a holy people, we're by nature offensive to the unholy. We're offensive to a godless culture, a culture of restraint, a culture of holiness, contrasts significantly with a culture of licentiousness. Right? That's one of those ways that we're righteous troublemakers, just by our restraint. The world is unrestrained. They have no sense of temperance, right? As Christians, we ought to be paving the way for that. But we also need to recognize that truth often costs estrangement. We're going to be called names. We're going to suffer for this. But this is something God still calls us to, and He is doing something with it. So, I wanted to end with these thoughts just to encourage us and underscore the fact that as educators ourselves, we ought to be righteous troublemakers. We can't be content to exist in silos where the only people we're having conversation with, the only people we're influencing are people who already agree with us. We need to be turning this over in a real way. The goal is for our students, the goal is even for us to go on and be culture builders ourselves. A classical Christian education that doesn't lead into the building of Christian culture has something wrong with it. I think that's got to be the goal, building Christian culture, because that's the way that we establish Christ's kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. All right, lest I take up another 45 minutes going down another rabbit hole, let me end here and see if we can open this up to Q&A, assuming that we actually have time for this.
Yes, thank you so much, brother, for such a powerful and impactful session. So I believe some of us will have questions. If you have any question, please drop your question in the chat box, or you can actually unmute your mic to ask your question. But before anyone asks any question, I would like to ask you first. I've been following Douglas Wilson's work for so many years. In fact, it was his work that influenced my starting up Reformation World Classical Christian School here in Nigeria. I'm so thankful that I read his work before I started hearing things about Douglas Wilson, because I believe if I've heard first, and I would have avoided him completely. But I really want to ask you to tell all the educators here and parents that how should they take in information about other
Mm,
believers when it tends to be slanderous? So how should they do that?
mm,
Because when you read Douglas Wilson and hear what people are saying, you are wondering, what are you guys saying? I've read Douglas Wilson, I've heard him. He didn't say all of these things. So that's my question to you.
mm. That's an excellent question. Yes, I think as Christians we should have a predisposition to not be entertainers of slander. Whenever people are saying slanderous things, we should not be party to it. Now, I can understand why this is a tricky one, because there's a sense in which some people's concerns with someone like Doug Wilson is the fact that he's got a public platform. And therefore, like, a lot of them think that what they're doing is just warning other people about this. But I think that we ought to do the due diligence and actually understand what it is that's being said. We should not just take the slander at face value and ask questions. Oh, what exactly did he say? Where did he say it? That kind of thing. Again, I think it's fascinating to see Doug Wilson treated the way he is, and I have my own theories about why there's real slander there. But I think that people should be willing to hear what he has to say for himself, read some of his own material, and and come to their own conclusions, as opposed to allowing other people to impose their thoughts on you. That's simply what I'd say.
Thank you so much. If you have any question, please unmute your mic and ask. I'm going to just give you about 20 seconds. If you don't have any question, I'll have to end today's webinar. Thank you.
Hello, I'm sorry, do you prefer to be called Lennox or Mr. Kalifungwa?
Lennox is great. Thank you.
Okay, Lennox, it's a pleasure to meet you. My name is Diana. I have actually been following you for quite some time. I follow Doug Wilson and a few others in the Reformed Presbyterian space. Just a brief intro here. I'm actually based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm in a place where secular education is almost exclusively tied to Unitarianism, if you will, and Reformed thinking, classical Christian education is not it's not espoused as heavily as I guess you would say just secular education, just all forms of secular education. So that includes a variety of things, including one of the reasons why I was drawn to Massachusetts is because I am very passionate about economic development, particularly in Nigeria. That's where my parents are from. I'm a first generation American. And I've deviated, kind of divorced myself of all things secular education, which is very unorthodox for someone of Nigerian descent to do. I'm very much a unicorn here for that reason. Now, my question is, when I'm interacting with there's a
Sorry, Diana, we lost you there. Looks like you got muted.
Yes. Please unmute.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yes.
Okay. So there's a large Christian scene here, but it's mostly geared towards college kids. And most of the students who are at the Harvards, the MITs, the Tufts, schools like that, especially a lot of the African students, they're geared towards globalism. Many of them are almost baptized in globalism. And globalism consists of so many different things, but very rarely is there any sliver of, there's not an appreciation for anything Christianity. You're almost directly at odds with Christianity in almost every way. I don't want to overgeneralize it, but that is the case. So I'm just curious, in considering that setting, I've kind of laid the groundwork of like what it's like in this environment, this atmosphere. How would you suggest we introduce classical Christian education to people, particularly young students and even sometimes adults who have been fully not just indoctrinated, but they have been captured. They have been baptized by what is called globalism, but is sometimes masking itself as so many other things. And they're professing Christians, but they are leaning more towards something else, and they're applying that standard of globalism across Africa, particularly in places like Nigeria and the infrastructure of Nigeria. What are some of the strategies, whether biblical strategies or just whatever it is that you would suggest we use to kind of combat that measure when God has placed us here providentially, and we're trying to navigate that situation? Thank you so much.
That's such an excellent question, and I hope you write a book based on your experiences at some point. This is fascinating. Yeah. I would say that you ought to begin with prayer. I think there's just no escaping the fact that this is really what we're dealing with fundamentally. People don't pursue evil and reject God because there's not enough evidence for God. The evidence is all around them, as Romans 1 tells us. It's the fact that their hearts are hardened. And so I think we need to be praying even as we do our work in a big way. The other thing is, I think in that kind of context, you don't want to do things alone. You always want to work alongside people so as to keep you sane and so as to strengthen your efforts as well. I think that's going to be very important. And I think the degree to which you can also establish your own institutions that have their own distinct culture, I think that's going to be a very big thing. And I mean, even like a culture of hospitality, for example. So in that area, see if you can throw a block party where it's just Christian stuff going on. Have a public psalm sing with great food that's free to the public. This is just me thinking off the top of my head. But you want to show people that there's a distinct fruit to this. And sometimes that's the attraction point, where people might not be ready to engage with the arguments, but they can't deny the fruit. And in many ways, the fruit is revealed in the culture. And so I think there's got to be an emphasis on building a culture. And I think one of the best ways to do that is by establishing institutions. So that might be starting some kind of a school, or maybe even like some worldview institute in that area where you invite all kinds of conversations to happen. Organize a public but cordial debate with an MIT or Harvard professor and have a conversation. Those are real things that you could do, where you're kind of now focusing on the apologetics aspect there. So those are some tangible things. The other side of it is, in the long run, we need to amplify our own voice as Christians. We need to be making use of, I think, media, entertainment, education. There's just no running away from that. And this is something that the world has done, which is why, and just as you're referring to, people have been indoctrinated to think in categories that are false. That's how things like globalism are propagated. People don't come across it in 5 minutes and embrace it then. It's something that they have been taught for much of their lives through the concentration camps of public schools, through the hot garbage of false media that tries to redefine good, and by thrusting in evil. And the point is, I think those are tools that we need to be wielding. Firstly, because they belong to God, and because I think those really are the potent tools of persuasion. I think that we need to be establishing our own schools. We need to be thinking long term. There's a sense in which, and I don't mean this in a pessimistic sort of way, but to the degree to which we can convince adults to think differently, we should. But perhaps our focus should be on a younger generation and actually building towards the future. I think that we do that by having more kids than our enemies. Really, I think there's just no escaping that. And then raising them in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and doing things like setting up schools that are actually shaping the way people think for the long term. Which means we might not see the fruit of our efforts in this lifetime, but we can certainly set up the foundations for it. And I think this is something we ought to be doing in Africa, and Africa specifically, because population-wise, demographically, it's still a great place to do that. In fact, it's a perfect place to do that compared to any other place in the world. Anyway, this could be a much longer conversation as well, but these are some ideas that come to me in terms of how we need to be engaging and dealing with these kinds of things. Thank you for that, Diana.
Thank you so much, Lennox. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, brother. Any other question? If you don't have any question, I would like to wrap today's webinar up. Do we have any question from anyone? Okay, so Bro Lennox, thank you so much for showing up today. Thank you for encouraging us.
Absolutely.
Someone is asking, please, can I get the link to the WhatsApp group? I joined the Substack. I'll send you a phone number to just kind of reach out to me, and then we can take it up from there. But thank you so much, Bro Lennox, for such a wonderful time. We really appreciate it. And for everyone that came here tonight, we're going to publish it on YouTube so that you can share with your friends and family. We need to get this message across Africa. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening, and bye-bye.
Take care.